All right, so we're on lesson 7 in the story of Elijah the prophet. Just a little bit of context though. So God permitted the Israelites to have a king, the greatest of those being King David, of course, but he still sent prophets. Prophets are those who communicate for God. They're the ones who tell us God's will and give us instructions. And so the greatest of these prophets was the prophet Elijah. Now, the prophets are not always popular because not everyone wants to do what God wants. And so Elijah particularly was having trouble with the king. And the king in this story, King Ahab, had a lot of problems, and he was led astray, and he was leading his people astray with the worship of false gods. And so that's why we have the story that we have in today's lesson. This is the last lesson before we start the New Testament, so I just want to make one more comment on the rest of the Old Testament before we continue. And that is, so after this story, after Elijah, we're going to have a period of time in which the people are exiled. That means they're taken away from their land, from their home. And this happens, God permits this to happen because they were not faithful to the covenant. They weren't faithful to the relationship that they had made with God, especially through Moses. And so they were taken away until they learned their lesson that you cannot have the promised land if you don't keep that covenant, if you don't have the relationship that you're supposed to have. And that's an important lesson for us because the promised land for us is heaven. And we cannot enter heaven unless we are faithful to that relationship with God that we establish in baptism. Now, this story is a very important story. The story that we read for today's lesson is about the fact that there is only one God. And this story is very dramatic that way and shows us this. But there's another lesson that's very important in here. And that is that King Ahab was led into sin because he married a pagan woman. This is not about women. This is about being careful who you marry. Because whoever you marry can lead you into sin. That's why it's so careful that you spend time with good people, that you make friends with good people, and that if you do end up getting married, that you end up marrying a good Catholic who is going to be faithful and to help you get to heaven and have a relationship with God. Because no matter who you marry, they are going to have an influence on you. They're going to move you in a particular direction, and you want to make sure that that's a good direction. So be very careful then who it is that you spend time with. Because again, in the story of Ahab and in many places in the Bible, we see that the spouse, the husband or wife, can lead their spouse in a good way or in a bad way. And Ahab is led into idolatry, which is against the first commandment. So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the first 2 commandments and study those and understand what it means to only worship the true God.